Michael Jordan stepped out of his sleek black SUV and surveyed the sprawling complex in front of him. It was early afternoon on a mild spring day, the sky a clear and endless stretch of blue above the gleaming windows of Lakeside Galleria. As he adjusted his sunglasses, he couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction. Most visitors to the mall saw only the wide parking lot and the enormous structure filled with shops, cafes, restaurants, and entertainment venues. For Michael, it represented more than just another commercial venture. He was part owner of Lakeside Galleria, a silent partner who had invested in the mall's development alongside several trusted associates. While he didn't care much for day-to-day involvement in retail operations, he'd been drawn to the idea of creating a place where families, tourists, and shoppers of all stripes could gather and enjoy themselves without worry or inconvenience. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. He preferred to keep his ownership status private. Too many times in his life, he'd seen how people changed the moment they realized who he was. They would fuss over him, clamor for autographs, offer special perks he had never asked for, and overall disrupt his desire for a normal outing. As one of the most recognizable athletes in the world, he understood the attention. Yet there were days like this one, when all he wanted was to wander through the corridors, have a quick meal, and see how the mall was running without fanfare. In a comfortable tracksuit, a discreet baseball cap pulled low, and expensive but unremarkable sneakers, he felt he could blend into the crowd at least long enough to observe things in their natural state. He walked past a group of teenagers who were excitedly discussing the latest basketball game. One of them mentioned his name in reverent tones, describing the time he'd seen Jordan play in person years back. Michael, listening quietly, felt a surge of pride tempered by a desire to remain anonymous. He grinned behind his sunglasses but kept moving. He wasn't heading for the high-end clothing stores or the exclusive jewelry shops. Instead, he had decided he would grab a bite to eat at one of the newest restaurants, a small bistro that had just opened in a cozy corner of the mall. Not many people had discovered it yet, but he'd heard good things through the grapevine. Inside the Galleria, natural light flooded the corridors through skylights, bathing the walkways in a pleasant glow. Potted plants lined the concourse, and the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh pretzels drifted from kiosks. He slipped through clusters of customers, some dressed to impress, others sporting casual attire, and eventually located the modest sign that read, "Savory and Sweet." It was a quaint little place with tables spaced far enough to afford a bit of privacy. The decor was simple: warm wooden floors, pastel walls, and bright flowers in vases on every table. Soft jazz music played overhead, the saxophone notes echoing gently against the chatter of late lunch patrons. He found a small table near the back, close to a large window that offered a view of a beautifully landscaped courtyard. Spring blossoms added splashes of pink and white, and the hush of a trickling fountain lent a soothing counterpoint to the lively atmosphere inside. He took off his sunglasses and placed them on the table, savoring the sense of peace. Hardly anyone had given him more than a passing glance so far. Every once in a while, a curious teenager or an older basketball fan might do a double take, wondering if this tall, athletic man could be who they thought he was. But so far, no one had approached him or asked for a selfie. He looked around, noting the staff moving between tables. Most were college-age servers, bright-eyed and smiling. At the center of it all, carrying two heavy trays at once, was a waitress with an air of quiet confidence. Her hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she maneuvered among the tables with a certain practiced grace. An older couple complimented her as she poured them iced water, and she responded with a polite nod, though Michael sensed a strain in her expression. He wondered if perhaps the restaurant was understaffed or if she was simply having a stressful day. A few minutes later, the same waitress approached his table. Without preamble, she set down a menu, her manner brusque but not outright rude. "We're a bit busy," she said, the words coming quickly. "I'll be back in a moment. Please decide what you want to drink." She didn't offer a smile or much of a greeting before hastening off to the next table. Michael raised an eyebrow. He rarely expected special treatment, but the lack of warmth was noticeable. Still, he chalked it up to the busyness of the lunch rush. He opened the menu, scanning the lunch items: sandwiches, salads, grilled specials, and a lineup of sweet desserts. Everything looked enticing. He'd had a light breakfast and felt ready to indulge. While he waited, He took in the scene again. A young mother feeding her toddler bits of bread, an older man reading the newspaper and sipping tea, and a table of college students laughing over something on one of their phones. The hush of normalcy comforted him. It reminded him that despite his fame, he could still enjoy ordinary moments like anyone else. Of course, a part of him also felt proud. This was, in some ways, his mall, a testament to his willingness to invest in community spaces. The waitress returned, exhaling a heavy breath as though she was already exasperated. She pulled a small notepad from her apron. "Know what you want?" she asked, tapping her pen impatiently. He glanced up, meeting her eyes for the first time. They were a warm hazel color, but she looked tense. Shadows of stress seemed to linger beneath them. She noticed him looking, and her expression hardened slightly, defensive as if she expected some complaint about slow service or a missing beverage. It was a look he had seen many times in busy restaurants, where waitstaff often anticipate criticism. He kept his voice calm and polite. "I'd like an iced tea to start, and then the grilled salmon with a side salad, please." He deliberated for a moment. "Could I also get the soup of the day?" The waitress nodded, scribbling the items onto her notepad. But right before she turned away, she paused, looking him over more carefully. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head. Sometimes people recognized him at this point, once they had a second to process his face. But her brow only furrowed, and she shrugged. "Anything else?" she asked, sounding bored. "That'll be all," he replied in an even tone. She spun on her heel and left. Michael took another long moment to appraise his surroundings. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin out, making him wonder why the waitress still seemed on edge. He considered briefly if he should wave the manager over or simply let it go. Causing a commotion was the last thing he wanted, and he was fully aware that staff in the restaurant world often had to juggle difficult tables and impatient customers. As time wore on, he realized that she was pointedly avoiding his table. The younger servers were clearing plates around him, refilling water glasses, and even stopping to check on other diners. But the waitress assigned to his table seemed almost determined to keep her distance. Every time he caught her eye, she looked away or hurried off with a tray. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and his iced tea still hadn't arrived. His stomach started to growl, but more than that, he felt a small flicker of annoyance. He reminded himself to stay patient. He knew that good help was hard to come by, and overreacting would solve nothing. Finally, he caught her as she was hurrying back from the kitchen. He lifted a hand. "Excuse me, She rounded on him abruptly, setting her hands on her hips. "I'll get to you when I can," she snapped, loud enough for a few people nearby to turn their heads. "We're understaffed today, so if you can't wait patiently, maybe you'd prefer another restaurant." A stunned hush fell around them. Even Michael, who prided himself on staying poised, felt his mouth drop open slightly. He could see other diners looking on in surprise. One or two recognized him instantly. He caught the flash of recognition in their eyes. But the waitress seemed clueless, or simply too frustrated to notice. He wrestled with his response. In the past, as an athlete, he had learned to let minor insults slide, especially from people who were obviously stressed. But this felt more personal, and he was beginning to suspect something else was going on. Still, he inhaled, determined not to escalate. "I understand you're busy," he said quietly enough to avoid drawing more attention. "But I'd appreciate even just a glass of water, or some acknowledgement that my order's being processed." She exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but we get all types in here, and you're not special. I don't need a lecture on how to do my job." She flashed a tight, mocking smile. "Why don't you give it a rest, and let me work?" With that, she stormed away to attend to another table. The shock lingered in the air. A group of teenagers seated a few tables away stared wide-eyed. One mouthed to his friend, "That's Michael Jordan." The friend nodded, his expression a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Michael took a breath and tried to shake off the embarrassment. He could have said, "Actually, I own part of this mall." But he didn't. He just sighed and settled back, unsure of how to proceed. The manager on duty, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a kind face, seemed to sense something was amiss. Michael saw him whisper something to the waitress, who merely shrugged and rolled her eyes in response. She then returned to the kitchen. The manager began making his way to Michael's table, a cautious smile on his face. "Sir, "I'm sorry for the wait," he said quietly. "We're a little short-staffed, but we'll get your meal out as soon as possible. Is there anything I can bring you while you wait?" Michael smiled kindly. "Some water would be nice," he said, keeping his tone neutral. He didn't want to get the waitress into trouble, but her attitude had definitely crossed a line. "And maybe you can check on my order. I've been here a while." The manager nodded vigorously. "Right away. I'm so sorry about this." He hurried off to the kitchen. Within a minute or two, he re-emerged with a glass of water and a hastily poured iced tea, assuring Michael that the soup and salmon would be out soon. Michael thanked him politely, sipping the water and trying to settle his nerves. He reflected on the situation. Part of him was tempted to call up the mall's general manager, who reported directly to him and his associates, and share what had happened. But he also knew that one incident, however uncomfortable, didn't define an entire establishment. People had bad days. Waiters and waitresses had personal lives filled with struggles. He thought back to his own early days, long before he rose to NBA stardom, remembering times when he had to work around the clock for scholarships and navigate personal stress that few saw from the outside. He decided that maybe he'd just let it go, enjoy his meal, and move on. 10 minutes later, the soup arrived. It was lukewarm and looked hastily prepared, as though it had sat in the kitchen for too long. The waitress all but slammed it onto the table without a word, then turned to leave. Michael cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, trying to keep things polite. She paused, gave him a single glare, and walked away. A man at the table next to Michael, who had recognized him almost immediately, leaned over. "I can't believe she's acting like that," he whispered. "She must not know who you are." Michael chuckled softly under his breath. "It's all right," he said. "I don't expect special treatment." The man shook his head. "Even if you were just a random customer, that's not okay. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry this is your experience here." Michael nodded in thanks, turning his attention to the soup. It tasted decent enough, but the subpar presentation and the temperature made it clear that it wasn't given proper care. He wondered how much was the result of short staffing and how much was the waitress's apparent resentment. His grilled salmon came out not long after with the salad on the side. He tried to eat slowly, his appetite dampened by the earlier tension. The flavor was good, which reassured him that the kitchen staff knew what they were doing, but his enjoyment was overshadowed by the lingering discomfort. Throughout his meal, the waitress never once returned to check on him. She served other tables, chatting cordially with some customers, but whenever she passed by Michael, her mouth tightened and she pointedly looked away. A few times he caught her throwing him scornful glances, as if she harbored some personal dislike that went beyond mere busyness. It didn't make sense to him. He considered different possibilities. Maybe she'd had a bad experience with a pushy customer who looked like him. Maybe she resented tall men in caps. Or maybe there was something else entirely going on in her life. The more he thought about it, the more perplexed he became. But ultimately, it wasn't his job to figure out her problems. He just wanted to finish his meal in peace. When he was about halfway through his salmon, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and noticed a message from one of his partners in the mall project. They were due for a short meeting with the mall manager to discuss an upcoming expansion. He typed a quick reply, letting them know he'd be there shortly. By the time he finished his meal, he decided he wouldn't bother ordering dessert. It just didn't feel worth another confrontation. Instead, he signaled the manager, who scurried over to the table with the bill. The waitress stood nearby, arms folded, as if silently daring him to complain about her. Michael handed the manager his credit card. The manager hurried off to run the transaction, and Michael took a moment to dab his mouth with the napkin, then stood to stretch his legs. The waitress, seeing him stand, walked over and gave him a once-over that was almost disdainful. "You need something?" she asked, her tone sharp, bordering on hostile. He inhaled slowly, deciding to keep his composure. "No, I think I'm good," he replied. "But if you could bring the receipt, that'd be great," she smirked. "Figured you'd be cheap on the tip anyway," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for him to hear. He felt his jaw tighten. He'd always been a good tipper, not just because he could afford it, but because he believed in rewarding good service. Still, Her comment stung. He resolved not to let it go unaddressed. But before he could speak, the manager returned, handing over the card and receipt. Michael signed it, left a tip that was decent, though not extravagant, and handed the slip back. Then, without another word, he took his sunglasses from the table, placed them on his face, and stepped away. There was a mild hush that fell over the bistro as he departed. A few tables of diners followed him with their eyes, exchanging looks that ranged from shock to amusement at the waitress's behavior. A couple of them whispered among themselves, presumably about whether or not the waitress realized she had just thrown attitude at one of the most famous athletes of all time. Michael tried to shrug it off as he made his way toward the escalators that led to the upper office corridors. His mind drifted to more important matters, like the meeting with the mall's general manager regarding the next expansion phase. He told himself that this was just one unfortunate incident. In the broader scheme of things, it didn't matter much. Still, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. He had invested in Lakeside Galleria partly because he wanted visitors to have a pleasant experience. If staff were treating customers like this, it reflected poorly on the entire operation. Upstairs, the offices lined a quieter hallway. The bustle of the mall was more muted here, replaced by the hum of air conditioning and the subdued drone of business phone calls behind closed doors. Michael walked into a suite labeled Mall Administration, where a receptionist greeted him enthusiastically. She was well aware of who he was, though he appreciated how discreetly she handled it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jordan," she said with a friendly smile. "Mr. Lawson is expecting you." He nodded, returning the smile. "Thank you." As he waited to be shown in, he glanced around the reception area. Modern furniture, tasteful art on the walls, and a large window that overlooked the courtyard below. A few minutes later, the receptionist guided him into a conference room where Jeff Lawson, the mall's general manager, sat reviewing documents. Jeff stood up immediately and extended a hand. "Great to see you," he said warmly. "How have you been?" They exchanged small talk for a moment, discussing the success of recent mall events and the upcoming promotional activities planned for summer. But partway through the conversation, Jeff's expression turned curious. "You look a bit unsettled," he remarked carefully. "Is everything okay? Did something happen downstairs?" Michael hesitated, unsure whether to mention the incident. He never wanted to come off as complaining, especially about service workers who often had tough jobs. But Jeff was a friend and an associate, and it directly concerned the mall's reputation. So he relayed a succinct version of the story. How he had gone to Savory and Sweet, how the waitress had been unusually rude and dismissive, and how he'd left feeling humiliated and disrespected. Jeff listened intently, his brow knitted in concern. "I am so sorry," he said, shaking his head. "That's unacceptable. I know the owners of that bistro personally. They pride themselves on good service. I can't imagine they'd be happy to hear this." He paused, pressing his lips together. "If you'd like, I can talk to the manager and have that waitress disciplined, or at least figure out what's going on." Michael sighed. "Look, I don't want to ruin someone's livelihood if they're just having a bad day. But she was really out of line. She didn't just ignore me, she made it personal. If she's doing that to me, she might be doing it to other customers too. That bistro is new, and I'd hate for it to fail because of poor service." Jeff nodded in understanding. "I'll handle it tactfully. We have protocols for staff who can't adhere to service standards. And trust me, the owners will want to know if there's someone damaging their reputation." He cleared his throat. "On another note, please don't let this sour your feelings about the mall. We've built up a strong clientele, and most of the employees here do an excellent job." Michael waved off the concern. "No worries. This place looks great. I'm always happy to see families enjoying themselves downstairs." They turned their attention to the expansion plans, studying architectural renderings and discussing projected timelines, costs, and potential new tenants. After an hour, they wrapped up. Michael told Jeff he planned to do a quick walkthrough of the new wing before heading out. Jeff offered to accompany him, but Michael insisted that he wanted to stroll quietly, incognito. Jeff grinned. "As incognito as a 6'6" basketball legend can be, I suppose." They shared a laugh, and Michael departed, making his way back down the corridor and toward the escalators. During his walk, he slipped into a sporting goods store to check out the selection of basketball shoes. It amused him to see a special display dedicated to his own signature line. A group of teenagers was clustered around it, excitedly pointing at the various colorways. He felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with pride. He eventually moved on, stopping briefly at a gadget store and then a bookstore, flipping through the best sellers. He noted the foot traffic. It was steady, if not bustling, but that was typical for a weekday afternoon. Overall, the mall seemed to be thriving. After an hour of unhurried browsing, he decided it was time to head home. On his way to the main entrance, he passed by the bistro again. Through the glass, he saw the waitress busy cleaning a table. For a split second, he contemplated going inside to give her a second chance, maybe order a coffee or a dessert. But then he decided against it. There was no reason to subject himself to another round of unpleasantness. As he stepped away, he caught sight of the manager talking to the waitress in an animated fashion. She looked defensive, her hands gesturing sharply. The manager's face was stern. Michael figured Jeff must have called the bistro's owner or manager, who was now addressing the issue. A small surge of guilt mingled with relief in Michael's chest. He didn't like the thought of anyone losing a job, yet the incident had been serious enough to warrant correction. Days passed. Michael found himself occupied with multiple commitments, charity events, meetings about other investments, and occasional promotional appearances. He hadn't had time to return to Lakeside Galleria. But the memory of the rude waitress still nagged at him. He kept thinking about her sharp tone, the contempt in her eyes, and the way she seemed to relish humiliating him. As someone who often championed respect and discipline, both on the basketball court and off, he found her behavior baffling. It was more than just stress. She had been outright antagonistic. A week later, he decided to swing by the mall again. He wanted to pick up a gift for a friend's birthday and also check on some final details regarding the upcoming expansion. He parked in his usual spot, strolling through a side entrance to avoid the busiest area. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed that Savory and Sweet was no longer bustling. A sign on the door announced a temporary closure for staff training and renovations. Michael paused, peering through the glass. The tables were empty and the lights were dimmed. He could see a man inside wiping down counters. Perhaps the owners had decided to revamp both their physical space and their service approach. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside where a few chairs had been stacked against the walls. The man looked up from his cleaning and approached. "I'm sorry, we're closed for a bit," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We're doing some retraining and touching up the interior before we reopen." Michael extended a hand. "I'm Michael Jordan. Nice to meet you." The man's eyes widened. "Oh, wow, it's an honor. I'm Daniel Chan, one of the co-owners here. Pleasure to meet you in person." They shook hands. Michael could see genuine admiration in Daniel's face, the kind of look he'd grown used to over the years. Daniel hesitated. "I've actually been meaning to reach out to you or to the mall management about an incident that happened recently. I heard you had a particularly bad experience here." Michael nodded slowly. "I did, but I understand you're taking steps to fix things." Daniel's face clouded. "That's right. After your visit, the manager reported what happened. Then Jeff Lawson, the mall's GM, contacted me. I was shocked. We strive for excellent customer service, but it seems one of our staff members was creating an extremely hostile environment." Michael glanced around, hands in his pockets. "It was unfortunate, yeah, but I also get that sometimes people have reasons for their behavior. Maybe something personal going on." Daniel sighed. "I tried to speak with her. She quit on the spot, said she didn't need the job and that she didn't care who you were or what the place stood for. Then she just walked out. The rest of the staff told me she'd been in a really foul mood for days, snapping at customers and coworkers alike. We suspect something personal was happening, but she refused to talk about it. Either way, we couldn't keep her on." Michael found himself feeling a twinge of pity. Sure, her behavior was unacceptable, but he also knew what it was like to be overwhelmed by pressures. "I'm sorry it ended like that," he said sincerely. Daniel nodded. "Me too, but hopefully we'll come back stronger. We're using this downtime to retrain our staff and make sure everyone's aligned with our values. We're also updating some of the decor, rethinking the menu, adding a few new dishes. We want to make a fresh start." Michael felt a sense of relief, seeing that something positive might grow out of a negative situation. "I look forward to trying out the new menu when you reopen," he said. Daniel's face lit up. "We'd be honored to have you back. Let me know whenever you'd like to stop by, and we'll make sure to set aside a nice table. And don't worry, we won't treat you differently just because you're Michael Jordan." He chuckled. Michael laughed, appreciating the friendly sincerity. "I'll just come by quietly, the way I prefer." They shook hands again, and Michael left, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Part of him was gratified that the bistro was taking steps to improve. Another part was sad that someone had lost a job, even if her behavior had justified it. Life could be complicated like that. One moment of anger or frustration could lead to a drastic change. He tried to brush the negative thoughts aside as he walked on, heading toward a high-end electronics store to buy that birthday gift. After browsing for a while, he selected a top-of-the-line pair of wireless headphones. As he stepped out of the store, he noticed that a new sign had gone up near the bistro's entrance, announcing the date of its grand reopening. 2 weeks from now. His mind drifted back to the waitress's harsh words, the humiliating feeling of being spoken to like a nuisance. He thought about how she never realized that he was an investor in the mall, someone who in a sense paid a portion of her wages. The irony wasn't lost on him. But at the end of the day, her ignorance might have saved him further embarrassment. If she had known, she might have tried to fake politeness or scramble to treat him better, which would have only made for a hollow interaction. A few more days passed. Invitations went out for the bistro's reopening, along with promotions for the entire mall. Coupons circulated on social media, featuring discounts and a new seasonal menu. Jeff Lawson emailed Michael, inviting him to attend a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the relaunch. Initially, Michael wasn't sure he wanted to go. These events often turned into photo ops that he generally preferred to avoid unless they were for a charitable cause. But Jeff mentioned that Daniel and his co-owner had planned a small reception to showcase the changes, and they'd love for him to give his unofficial stamp of approval. On the day of the reopening, he arrived in the late morning. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance of Savory and Sweet. Local press, mall employees, curious shoppers, and a few invited guests. Balloons in pastel colors framed the doorway, and a large banner read, "Welcome to the new and improved Savory and Sweet." Michael wore a casual blazer over a simple shirt and jeans. No cap, no sunglasses. He figured if he was going to show support, he might as well do it openly. Predictably, whispers and excited glances rippled through the crowd as people recognized him. But the presence of the press also gave him a measure of comfort. People would be less likely to swarm him for autographs in a more formal setting. Daniel greeted him warmly, introducing him to a few local reporters who asked a couple of polite questions about the mall and what he thought of the bistro. He kept his answers upbeat and diplomatic, praising the efforts to improve customer service and highlight local culinary talent. The crowd applauded as Daniel cut a ceremonial ribbon, and the doors swung open to reveal a bright, refreshed interior. The walls had been repainted in soft, welcoming tones. New light fixtures cast a warm glow over the tables, and a centerpiece dessert display drew the eye with its array of pastries and cakes. Michael followed the small throng of guests inside. Servers, now wearing crisp uniforms and genuine smiles, offered samples of new menu items, tiny cups of lobster bisque, bite-sized quiches, and petite sweet tarts. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the last time he was there. The staff moved around confidently, their demeanor calm yet professional. He noticed the manager from before, looking relieved and proud, handing out menus and explaining the changes to curious customers. For the next hour, Michael mingled discreetly, chatting with Daniel and a few other patrons. A local journalist gently probed, "We heard there was an incident a while back, and that's part of why the owners decided to retrain. Could you shed any light on that?" Michael shrugged lightly, not wanting to single anyone out. "There was a situation. The important thing is that the bistro took it as an opportunity to grow and offer even better service. I respect that." He gave the journalist a nod that signaled he wouldn't say more. Sensing Michael's boundaries, the journalist moved on to interview another guest. After sampling a few of the new dishes, Michael made his way to a quiet corner by a large painting of a seaside landscape. He sipped a refreshing lemonade, letting the flavors of the sweet pastries linger on his palate. Daniel joined him, looking pleased but exhausted. "Thanks again for coming," he said. "It really means a lot to us that you'd support this reopening." Michael placed his glass down on a small table. "It's no problem. The changes look great. I'm happy to see you turning things around." Daniel exhaled, relief evident in the slump of his shoulders. It's been a stressful month, but also a chance to rethink our whole approach. We want every guest to feel valued. Michael nodded thoughtfully. It's a good philosophy. Just remember that treating guests right doesn't mean you can't also look after your staff. Happy employees lead to happy customers. Daniel grinned. Agreed. We've been talking a lot about that. Better schedules, more training, and open door policy for grievances. We even brought in a consultant to help us streamline operations. We're confident that the changes will stick. The event began to wind down. People gradually filtered out, some heading to shop in the rest of the mall, others lingering to chat over coffee. Michael shook hands with Jeff Lawson, who thanked him for attending. Then Michael made his way toward the exit. Before stepping out, he glanced back one last time at the bistro's new interior. The memory of that humiliating lunch was replaced by this fresh image of a brighter, kinder environment. He felt a certain satisfaction, not just for himself, but for the many customers who would dine there in the future. Maybe they'd never know how close the place came to losing its chance at success, all because of one disgruntled waitress. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the waitress humiliating Michael Jordan? How do you think he will respond? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.